Hello, this is Elizabeth, and welcome back to Root of Ramose, a poetry series in which we observe the mechanics, aesthetics, and meaning of the greatest founding texts of the Western poetic tradition. Today, we will be concluding our textual analysis of the Epic of Gilgamesh by examining Tablet 11. This tablet, in particular, will include Uta-napishti's account of the Great Flood, along with Gilgamesh's final attempts at attaining eternal life. Now, before we get started, I did want to mention now that while there are details in this tablet that call to be compared to the biblical telling of Noah's flood, as much as I would like to, I won't be including that kind of analysis in today's video. However, there is a high likelihood that I will make a video focusing on a deep comparison of the two in the near future. As always, all of the resources I used are in the description, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know down below. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with this final poetic analysis of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11. Our final tablet begins with Gilgamesh explaining that he arrived with every intention of fighting Uta-napishti, but then changed his mind upon seeing just how similar they were to one another. Uta-napishti then chooses to disclose the story of the Great Deluge. The first notable detail of his account is that in the town of Shirapak, the gods were once in it when it was decided that the deluge would be sent. This detail gives us an insight into the beliefs of the Sumerian people and aligns with what we've already learned about their spiritual practices, namely that there is a kind of synergistic relationship between humans and the divine. In Uta-napishti's story, there is mention of the god Ea, who we will soon see play an important role in what unfolds. In Mesopotamia, Ea was considered the god of water, and was a member of the Anunnaki class of gods. It's stated that his character was presented often in Akkadian myth as, quote, a clever mediator who could be devious and cunning. Rather appropriately, he is also linked to the idea of purification and ritual cleansing involving water. In the context of this epic, Ea is the god that decides to tell the people of Shirapak that they must leave behind their possessions and build a boat in order to survive. He provides detailed instructions on the dimensions of the boat, with it having each side the same length. So after relaying the news to the human citizens, Uta-napishti is the one who agrees to follow the commands of Ea, his master. He asks Ea how he will explain himself to the city as well as to the crowd and elders. And what is his response? Get this, it's really interesting. Ea then commands Uta-napishti to tell his people that Enlil now hates him, and that he must go to the ocean below to live with Ea, my master. Okay, so I have a lot to say about how to interpret this detail. You could explore it in about 3 different ways. What Ea says here could be interpreted as 1, the truth of what happened, 2, the intention of what Ea planned to happen, or 3, a lie about what would happen. First of all, the idea of Ea residing in the ocean below does align with mythology of his identity. As Ea's mythological identity evolved over time, he was considered to have a domain over the fresh waters beneath the earth. That's right, beneath the earth. The other point I want to make, and this may be a stretch, but if we are to take what Ea says here seriously, that Uta-napishti must go down to the ocean below to live with Ea, his master, then he's not building just some boat. He's building a watercraft capable of submerging underwater. A boat/submarine. That would explain why Uta-napishti is instructed to build essentially a cube, a very strange characteristic which resembles no boat that has ever been constructed in recorded history. It's almost as if it was designed to sink. Yet, as we will see, in this narrative telling, Uta-napishti makes no explicit mention of submerging underwater to go to Ea's domain. So I don't know. It's just such an interesting and strange detail that never really is explained or resolved by this text. And I just really wanted to throw that out there as a possible reading for that detail. Regardless of what the true intent of Ea's words really are here, it works. The people of Shuruppak come to help build the boat with Uta-napishti. As mentioned before, they provide the dimensions. We also see that oxen and lambs were provided daily for the workmen of the boat, and that the feast was like the days of New Year. So why is that the case? What is the significance here? Regarding the significance of the New Year's festival, called Ikitu, in ancient Mesopotamia, Evan Andrews states the following. This early New Year's celebration dates back to around 2000 BC, and is believed to have been deeply intertwined with religion and mythology. During the Ikitu, statues of the gods were paraded through the city streets, and rites were enacted to symbolize their victory over the forces of chaos. Through these rituals, the Babylonians believed the world was symbolically cleansed and recreated by the gods in preparation for the new year and the return of spring. So with that insight, when looking back at the text, we can see that the building of the boat and celebration of the daily feast was done in the spirit of the belief that the people had victory over the forces of chaos. As we read on, we'll see and decide if that's really the case or not. Upon finishing the construction of the boat, Uta-napishti loads his worldly possessions. This includes silver, gold, livestock, friends and acquaintances, family, beasts of the field, creatures of the wild, and members of every skill and craft. At the very first glimmer of brightening dawn, there rose on the horizon a dark cloud of black, and bellowing within it was Adad the storm god. The gods Shalat and Hanish were going before him, bearing his throne over mountain and land. The god Erekal was uprooting the mooring poles. Ninurta, passing by, made the weirs overflow. The Anunnaki gods carried torches of fire, scorching the country with brilliant flashes. The stillness of the storm god passed over the sky, and all that was bright then turned into darkness. He charged the land like a bull on the rampage. He smashed it in pieces like a vessel of clay. For a day the gale winds flattened the country, quickly they blew, and then came the deluge. Like a battle, the cataclysm passed over the people. One man could not discern another, nor could people be recognized amid the destruction. So to go over those lines, as the storm arrives, it is represented by several gods. This includes Adad, Shalat, and Hanish, Erekal, Ninurta, and the Anunnaki gods. Without a doubt, this is an event enacted by several deities, representing the immensity of the event. As we can see in this passage, the imagery is incredibly brutal and very vivid. There is the use of the simile involving a bull on the rampage and a vessel of clay. This invokes a kind of senseless, aimless anger that so easily destroys an entire city as if it were just some small, fragile thing. It's described that the country was not only burned down, but then the winds completely flattened the land, and then the deluge came. As the text describes, it was absolute chaos and confusion, and even the lines, "One man could not discern another, nor could people be recognized amid the destruction," could be taken further as a kind of dehumanization through elimination of distinct identity. Moving on, as we can see, there are even gods within the land that actually leave the city and went up to the heaven of Anu. It describes them as laying like dogs curled up in the open. It's clear that the gods had made a home in the land of Shuruppak, and they were now displaced. Then, we are presented with the goddess belet-ili, The goddess cried out like a woman in childbirth. For context, belet-ili was considered the mother goddess and creator of humankind. While her role in myth would diminish over time, that appears to be the role she plays in this text, given her response to the devastation of the people of Shuruppak. Here, belet-ili wails, and she also gives us an insight into why the deluge has happened. She explains, "The olden times have turned to clay because I spoke evil in the gods' assembly. How could I speak evil in the gods' assembly and declare a war to destroy my people? It is I who gave birth, these people are mine, and now like fish, they fill the ocean." This is huge. In this account of the deluge, it is stating that the reason for the flood was because of a dispute amongst the gods. The result of this understanding is that the Anunnaki gods were weeping with her. The text then carries on to humanize the deities by showcasing their suffering. This passage makes it clear to us that the people were not all able to successfully abate divine chaos after all. The weather has returned to normal, but the people have turned to clay. This potentially could be interpreted as a return to the beginning of the creation of man, suggesting a cyclical nature of time. The other detail to take note of here is that, without a proper burial, there would be no way to honor the dead in ceremony. They would be completely stranded and forgotten in Kur. This aspect of the aftermath certainly adds to the scope of the narrative's tragedy. Moving on, we see the floodplain was flat like a roof of a house. So while the storm has passed, everything is still completely underwater. At the realization of this, Uta-napishti weeps. In 14 places there rose an island. So this suggests that there are a few places where land is peeking through the flooded area. For 7 days, Uta-napishti's ship is eventually ported around the mountain of Nemush to wait out the flooding of the deluge. This may have been what we know today as the mountain Pir Omar Gudrum in Iraqi Kurdistan. Next, Uta-napishti sends out birds to scout for land. First is a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. The dove and the raven did have symbolic meaning in Mesopotamia, and I'll go ahead and list that on the screen right now. But as for the swallow, there wasn't really anything that could be convincingly connected to the Mesopotamian belief system, so I'm not entirely sure what role it plays in this scene. In light of the clear symbolic meaning of the dove contrasting with the raven, the fact that the raven is the one that brings news of land could have a few possible interpretations. First, it could be that finding land, while it may seem like a positive event, could actually be signifying that Uta-napishti and his shipmates are being led towards death by going to land. However, in this passage, that doesn't appear to be the tone presented. What may be a more likely reading is that the raven, which is a symbol of news and of doom, is meant to parallel and reflect the passage of Uta-napishti and his ship. Here, the raven is meant to reflect the unexpected and now bittersweet survival of the ship by inverting the expectation of which bird brings good news of land. This implies that Uta-napishti was not meant to survive, and it goes against the order of nature and the order of the divine. Regardless, Uta-napishti is grateful for his survival and for discovering that the waters are lowering. In response, he makes an offering to the gods. This involves incense on the peak of the mountain, where he performs his ceremonial ritual. For emphasis of its importance, there is a refrain of, "The gods did smell the savor." The gods then gathered like flies to his offering. This shows not only the desperation of the gods in this context, but it also illustrates the symbolic relationship that was believed to be held between the people and their gods of this age. Soon, Enlil arrives and catches sight of the ship and becomes enraged at the Igigi. He knows that someone had interfered with his plans, as it is confirmed in the text that no man was meant to survive the destruction. As we see in the text, Ninurta points out that only Ea could have knowledge of how all things are done. We then get an interesting explanation. Ea speaks to Enlil and asks him how he could act without counsel and bring on the deluge. This, of course, is referencing the divine council that was composed of several major deities, the most prominent being Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Inanna. As we can see here, Ea suggests that Enlil could have handled the matter more delicately. His list mentions the methods of lion, wolf, famine, and plague as other, more favorable options. This portion may also be slyly referencing another poem, the creation story, with the lines that read, "Like a wolf devours against Enki the water of the rear of the boat, like a lion strikes down." If our text is making a reference to the creation story, it could be yet another example of demonstrating the cyclical nature of time, connecting the destruction of mankind with its genesis of mankind. Next, we have mention of Atrahasis, which is actually an alternate name for Uta-napishti. Atrahasis is a name used in other accounts detailing this flood myth. Given what happens next, it makes perfect sense that his name would then be changed to reflect the change in his identity. The change, of course, being when Enlil makes both Uta-napishti and his wife immortal by blessing them by their foreheads. Uta-napishti was then taken far away to reside where the rivers flow forth. This can be taken to mean the origin of the water of life or the primordial waters. So after Uta-napishti shares his story, at this point in the text there is a shift to the present. Uta-napishti asks Gilgamesh, who will convene for you at the gods' assembly, so you can find the life you search for. He then gives Gilgamesh a trial to go 6 days and 7 nights without sleep. This trial is obviously meant to parallel the amount of time Uta-napishti spent on his ship abating divine death appointed by the deluge. Obviously, you can argue this would be a reasonable trial because sleep is representative of a kind of death. Given what we already know about Gilgamesh, it seems like this would be an easy task for him. If we recall from the beginning of the epic, when Enkidu had met Shamat, she had told him how Gilgamesh went day and night without sleep, in Tablet 1, line 239. However, it turns out that this journey has changed Gilgamesh, because he quickly falls asleep like a fog. This suggests that he fell asleep without his own awareness. Uta-napishti and his wife discuss the futile nature of Gilgamesh's desire for life. He then commands his wife, "Go, bake for him his daily bread loaf, and line them up by his head, and mark on the wall the days that he sleeps." Now looking at that, why bread? Why not some other way of marking time? I couldn't personally find a deeper connection as far as a symbolic meaning in the case of bread. Yet, if we observe the text, we can see 7 loaves of bread, yet again presenting that mystic Sumerian number. We also know that each loaf of bread holds a different attribute. My best guess is that this is meant to represent 7 kinds of death, equivalent to Gilgamesh's 7 days of symbolic death. Otherwise, it may just be meant as a form of divination that would have been easily understood by Sumerian audiences. Nevertheless, upon waking Gilgamesh and presenting his time asleep, he is confronted with dread. Gilgamesh asks, "O Uta-napishti, what should I do and where should I go? A thief has taken hold of my flesh, for there in my bedchamber death does abide, and wherever I turn, there too will be death." This passage shows us that Gilgamesh is no longer able to conquer sleep, and is fully aware of his own mortality and of his endless courting of death. As a response to this lament, Uta-napishti does not answer Gilgamesh. Instead, he exiles ur-shanabi from the shore and instructs him to lead Gilgamesh to bathe himself and restore his appearance to his kingly state, including a new kerchief and royal robes. He is then to guide him to return to his city. I think it's interesting that Uta-napishti doesn't provide a direct response to Gilgamesh in this instance. I think this choice adds to the believability of the scene, the humanity of it, and it takes into account the psychic state of our characters and handles them with care. In this case, it may be that Uta-napishti is giving the punishment that belongs to Gilgamesh to ur-shanabi instead, because he sees how much he is already suffering. Now, after Gilgamesh has bathed and clad himself in his royal attire, he is ready to return home to Uruk. At the behest of Uta-napishti's wife, Uta-napishti provides Gilgamesh with a parting mystery of the gods. He tells him about the plant of rejuvenation. He provides a few details to Gilgamesh, such as it looks like a box thorn and has prickles like a dog rose. Right away, Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet and is pulled down to the ocean below. He finds the plant, cuts loose the stones from his feet, and emerges to the surface. He tells ur-shanabi that it is the plant of heartbeat. He then shares his plans of bringing his discovery to Uruk to feed to an ancient in order to test out the plant's properties, and then to, of course, have it himself in order to be young again. As they stop on their journey home to rest, Gilgamesh finds a pool where he can bathe. This is where the snake catches the scent of the plant, then pierces and takes the plant. As the snake turns away, it sheds its skin, denoting that it has returned to its youth. As a response, Gilgamesh cries for his loss and considers how he has suffered not just for himself, but also the lion of the earth. Now, this statement is important because of what lions represent, and I cannot believe that it took me this entire series to realize this point. In the symbolic language of Sumer, the lion is the great solar animal. Just as the light of the sun never varies, the lion exemplifies the clear light of awareness of eternity. So those statues of Gilgamesh wrestling lions is a representation of him wrestling with eternity. I think that's really cool, and I can't believe I never realized the connection until making this final analysis. Nearing the final few lines of the text, we see them, in spite of the tremendous loss of the plant of rejuvenation, we see them as they continue on their way to Uruk. Gilgamesh speaks to ur-shanabi, and we see the familiar lines, climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth, survey its foundation, examine the brickwork. In this case, we can understand that Gilgamesh is sharing with ur-shanabi what he plans to build. Additionally, we can easily recognize that this is a direct return to the opening of the epic. This narrative structure could be loosely considered an Ouroboros ending, where the story ends how it began. As you may or may not know, the Ouroboros is an ancient symbol that depicts a serpent eating its own tail. The earliest record of the Ouroboros was found in 1600 BC in ancient Egypt. The symbol was used to document the Egyptians' understanding of the sun and was said to represent the travels of the sun disk. The word comes from Greek and translates literally to tail eater. In this case, I think it's so interesting that the epic would have ended this way, as a narrative loop, given that the final tablet is dealing with themes of life and death and eternity stolen by a snake. I think it's also interesting that there are parallels that can be made in the viewpoints of the Egyptians as well as the Sumerians, as far as their conception of eternity being represented by the sun. So, this notion of a lion representing eternity along with the sun, along with the Ouroboros, these are all cases in which eternity is being referenced by different cultures. What more can I say about the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11? I guess I wanted to talk about dramatic irony. In this last tablet, it was used very heavily, and despite the fact that dramatic irony is generally credited to the Greeks with their tragedies, I almost wonder if they weren't heavily influenced by the use of dramatic irony in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Of course, the reason for why the Sumerians used dramatic irony was not for humor, like the Greeks, but rather to show the complexity of life and human striving in the face of ruthless brutality and death. I'm sure upon a second reading, there would be a quality of emotional depth added throughout the narrative because of the tension between Gilgamesh's intentions and how the events actually unfold. Other than that, I feel as though this epic is a very solid work, in spite of the fact that there are so many missing pieces. There are so many segments that have still yet to be fully translated or found. This particular work is interesting for a variety of reasons, and I guess I shouldn't go into it now. So I will leave you now. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, and I will see you soon. Alright, take care guys. Bye.